I have to warn you, this isn't one of those stories you hear and forget. This really happened to me, and it changed the entire dynamic of my family forever. The suffocating weight of my brother's toast settled over the Thanksgiving table, pinning me to my chair. He held his wine glass aloft, a baccarat crystal flute that caught the light from the dining room chandelier, making the cheap Merlot inside look like liquid rubies. The centerpiece, a meticulously carved turkey glistening under a glaze of its own fat, sat between us like a sacrificial offering. We were all gathered for the one day a year we pretended to like each other, and my brother Mark had just turned his annual performance of smug superiority into a public execution. And finally, he said, his voice slick with faux affection, his eyes locking onto mine, a toast to my little sister, Chloe. May she finally find a career that doesn't involve dusty books and student loans. Because let's be honest, at this rate, she's going to be single forever, living with 20 cats. A few choked laughs sputtered from around the table, my aunt, my cousin, even my own father. They were the kind of laughs that died in the throat, sharp and guilty. In that moment, with the smell of sage and disappointment filling the air, my brother didn't just insult me. He wrote my future, and the rest of my family silently co-signed the draft. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The worst part about Mark's cruelty was that it was never a simple punch. It was always wrapped in the guise of a joke, a well-meaning piece of advice, or brutal honesty. He was the golden child of our Winnetka, Illinois family, the one who checked every box on the suburban success checklist. He'd gone to Northwestern for finance, married his college sweetheart, Amanda, a woman whose personality seemed to be entirely composed of Lululemon and passive aggression, and was now a junior vice president at a LaSalle Street investment firm. His life was a straight, upward line of predictable achievements, each one celebrated by our parents with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious figures. My path was different. I had chosen literature. I found solace and meaning in stories, in the quiet, forgotten corners of history. I became a research librarian, a job that to me was a sacred trust, a stewardship of knowledge. To my family, especially to Mark, it was a glorified hobby. So you get paid to shush people? He'd ask at every family gathering, a smirk playing on his lips. Sounds lucrative. That Thanksgiving was the nadir. After his toast, the conversation skittered away, leaving me in a silent, burning pool of humiliation. I excused myself, claiming a sudden headache, and retreated to my childhood bedroom. The floral wallpaper, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cage. I could hear their muffled laughter from downstairs, the clinking of forks on my mother's best china. No one came to check on me. No one ever did when Mark took his shots. Later, my mother would find me packing my overnight bag and offer a flimsy apology on his behalf. "Oh, honey, you know how he is," she'd said, smoothing down the bedspread. "He's just competitive. He doesn't mean it." But he did mean it. Every syllable. He saw my life, so different from his, as a personal failure, a stain on the family's pristine image. My contentment was an affront to his ambition. My single status was, in his eyes, proof of my undesirability. That night, driving back to my small apartment in the city, the Chicago skyline a blur of indifferent lights through my tears, I didn't feel resolve. I didn't feel anger. I just felt erased. I made a quiet promise to myself that night. I would not be back for another holiday. I would starve myself of my family before I let Mark feast on my dignity again. For the next 6 months, I kept that promise. I screened my mother's calls, let Mark's texts go unanswered, and sent polite, non-committal cards for birthdays and Easter. I threw myself into my work at the Harold Washington Library Center. I took on extra projects, curated a new exhibit on pre-Columbian artifacts, and started writing a children's book based on an obscure myth I'd uncovered. My life became quiet, small, and for the first time, entirely my own. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. It was during that time that I met him. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic encounter. It was ordinary, which is perhaps why it felt so real. I was in the library's special collections, hunched over a medieval manuscript, my magnifying glass tracing the faded Latin script. A man sitting a few tables away asked me a question about the illuminations. He had kind eyes, a quiet intensity, and he wore a simple gray sweater that had seen better days. He didn't ask what I did for a living. He asked me what I was passionate about. That question unlocked something in me. For 2 hours, we talked about history, about art, about the stories hidden in the margins of the world. His name was Julian. He told me he was in Chicago for business, something in the tech space. He never mentioned a company name, and I never asked. It didn't seem to matter. What mattered was the way he listened, the way his gaze never wavered, the way he made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was in town for another week, and we spent every evening together. We went to hole-in-the-wall jazz clubs, walked along the lakefront in the biting spring wind, and talked for hours in a dimly lit coffee shop in my neighborhood. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to perform or apologize for who I was. I wasn't Mark's weird sister or the librarian. I was just Chloe, and to him, that seemed to be more than enough. When he left for New York, I was sure I'd never hear from him again. It was a perfect, fleeting connection, a beautiful parenthesis in my quiet life. But the next day, a bouquet of rare, deep purple calla lilies arrived at my desk with a note. "Thank you for showing me what's hidden in the margins. Jay." A week later, he called. A month after that, I was on a plane to New York. The city that had always intimidated me felt like home with him. He lived in a beautiful but not ostentatious apartment in the West Village. It was filled with books and art, not symbols of wealth. He never talked about money. He talked about ideas. He was building something, he said, a platform to help small artisans connect directly with a global market. It sounded noble, ambitious, and slightly precarious, just like my life. It felt like we fit. Our relationship unfolded across state lines, a series of weekend flights, late-night phone calls, and the growing certainty that I had found my person. I never told my family about him. He was my secret, my sanctuary. He was the one part of my life that Mark couldn't touch, couldn't analyze, couldn't devalue with a condescending smirk. I was terrified of what their judgment would do to this beautiful, fragile thing we were building. So I kept him to myself, a pearl forming in the closed, protective shell of my new life. But I knew deep down that a secret this wonderful couldn't stay hidden forever. I just never imagined the circumstances under which the truth would finally come out, or the shockwave it would send through the perfectly curated world of my family. The proposal happened on a rainy Tuesday in October, almost a year after that horrible Thanksgiving. I was in New York for the week, helping Julian unpack boxes in his new place. He'd moved. When I'd asked him why, he'd just smiled and said, "Needed a bit more room." The phrase was a staggering understatement. His new place was a penthouse duplex overlooking Central Park, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the entire city feel like a painting made just for us. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. I remember standing in the center of the vast empty living room, the gray light of the storm washing over the polished marble floors, and feeling a sudden, sharp pang of imposter syndrome. This wasn't my world. This was the world Mark aspired to, the world he weaponized to make me feel small. I felt a familiar coil of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Julian must have sensed it. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. "Too much?" he whispered, his voice warm against my ear. "It's a lot," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "The view is incredible, but—" I trailed off, not knowing how to articulate the sudden chasm I felt opening between us. This level of success, this visible, undeniable wealth, it was the language my family spoke, and I had spent my entire life refusing to learn it. He turned me around to face him, his expression serious. "Chloe, look at me. This is just glass and stone. It's a container. What matters is what we put inside it. And all I want to put inside it is you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't make a grand speech. He just opened the box and looked me in the eye, his gaze steady and full of a love so profound it felt like it could hold up the sky. "I know it's a little soon," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know this," he gestured vaguely at the opulent space around us, "is a lot to take in. But my life was black and white before I met you. You brought the color. I don't want to live in monochrome ever again. Will you marry me?" Inside the box was a ring, but it wasn't a massive, flashy diamond. It was an antique platinum setting, intricately carved with a floral design, holding a single, flawless sapphire the color of a twilight sky. It was understated, elegant, and timeless. It was me. Tears streamed down my face as I nodded, unable to speak. He slid the ring onto my finger, and it was a perfect fit. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the storm raged outside, the city lights beginning to glitter below. But as I looked at the sapphire on my hand, a different image flashed in my mind. Mark, holding his wine glass, his face a mask of smug pity. Single forever. The words which had haunted me for a year suddenly lost their power. They weren't a prophecy anymore. They were a joke. A dark, bitter rage, the kind I had been swallowing my entire life, began to bubble up inside me, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the helpless anger of a victim. It was cold, clear, and sharp. It was the anger of someone who had just been handed a weapon. I had spent my whole life on the defensive, absorbing my brother's casual cruelty. Now I had a shield. No, not a shield, a sword. A quiet, elegant, devastatingly effective sword. The plan began to form right then and there, a blueprint snapping into place in my mind. It wouldn't be a screaming match or a dramatic confrontation. That was Mark's style. Mine would be a quiet checkmate. A public revelation delivered with a polite smile. I realized I finally had something that my family, and especially Mark, understood. Power. Julian's power, reflected onto me. It was a currency they traded in, a language they revered. And I was about to show them just how fluent I could be. My resolve hardened into something diamond sharp. I would go back for Thanksgiving. I would walk into that house, into that dining room that had been the arena for so much of my humiliation, and I would not just prove my brother wrong. I would dismantle his entire worldview. I would hold up a mirror to his snobbery, his materialism, his pathetic, narrow definition of success, and I would let him see his own reflection in the brilliant, undeniable light of my happiness. The next few weeks were a masterclass in strategic omission. When I finally called my mother to tell her my news, I was intentionally vague. "Mom, I have something to tell you. I'm engaged." The shriek on the other end of the line was deafening. The questions came in a rapid-fire torrent. Who is he? What does he do? Where is he from? How did you meet? I fed her carefully curated breadcrumbs. His name is Julian. He's a wonderful man. He's in the tech business. We met through my work. I left out last names, company details, and any mention of penthouses overlooking Central Park. I let her imagination, conditioned by years of my perceived failures, fill in the blanks. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the assumptions being made. She was likely picturing a fellow librarian, or maybe a struggling app developer. Someone nice and artistic, someone Mark would approve of with a condescending pat on the head. The final piece of the setup came the week before the holiday. "And Mom," I said, my voice carefully casual, "we'll be there for Thanksgiving. Julian is so excited to meet everyone." The trap was set. The bait was laid. Mark would be expecting the same old Chloe, the family charity case, perhaps with a slightly less pathetic +1 in tow. He would be armed with his usual arsenal of backhanded compliments and patronizing questions. He would walk into that dinner confident, smug, and utterly in control of the family narrative. He had no idea he wasn't walking into a family dinner. He was walking into an ambush, and I, his quiet, sensitive, bookish little sister, would be the one to spring it. The thought sent a chilling, exhilarating thrill through me. For the first time in my life, I was actually looking forward to Thanksgiving. The drive to my parents' house in Winnetka felt different this year. Usually, it was a slow crawl toward a predetermined humiliation, my stomach tightening with each familiar landmark. But sitting beside me in the rented black Lincoln Town car, Julian's calm presence was a fortress. He was dressed in what I'd come to learn was his uniform of quiet luxury, a dark, impeccably tailored wool coat over a simple gray cashmere sweater, jeans that probably cost more than my first car, and understated leather boots. To the untrained eye, he was just a handsome, well-dressed man. But to an eye like my brother's, an eye trained to spot the subtle tells of wealth and status, Julian was a walking, talking enigma. He wore a Patek Philippe Calatrava, a watch so refined and expensive that its value was in its inconspicuousness. It wasn't a Rolex meant to shout. It was a masterpiece meant to whisper. I knew Mark would notice the watch, and I knew it would drive him crazy. "You ready for this?" Julian asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. His was warm and steady. "There, a lot?" "I can handle a lot," he said with a soft smile. "I'm marrying you, aren't I?" I laughed, a real genuine laugh. The knot in my stomach loosened just a little. Just follow my lead. Let Mark think he's in charge. Let him ask his questions. The less you say, the better. My specialty, he replied, leaning back against the plush leather. I once sat through a 3-hour board meeting and only said 7 words. As we pulled onto my parents' street, lined with stately brick Georgians and perfectly manicured lawns, my heart began to pound a familiar, anxious rhythm. Mark's brand new Mercedes G-Wagon, a monstrous, glossy black cube, was already parked in the driveway. He always arrived early to establish dominance. We instructed the driver to park on the street, a few houses down, adding another layer to our understated arrival. Walking up the flagstone path, I felt a tremor of the old fear, the muscle memory of 1,000 small slights. But then Julian's hand found the small of my back, a silent, supportive pressure, and I straightened my shoulders. I was not the same woman who had fled this house in tears a year ago. We rang the bell. My mother flung the door open, her face a flurry of nervous excitement. "Chloe, you're here! And you must be Julian." She pulled him into an awkward hug, her eyes doing a rapid, full-body scan, trying to categorize him. I could see the flicker of confusion. He didn't fit the struggling artist narrative she had likely prepared for. Mark and Amanda appeared in the doorway behind her, a matched set of smug condescension. Mark's eyes went immediately to Julian, a predator sizing up new prey. "So you're the guy," he said, extending a hand but not stepping forward, forcing Julian to cross the threshold into his territory. "Mark, Chloe's brother." "Julian," he replied, his handshake firm but not aggressive. "A pleasure to meet you." The next hour was a slow, agonizing dance of social chess. My father gave Julian a cursory handshake before retreating to the den to watch the football game. My aunt and uncle asked him polite, surface-level questions about the weather in New York, but Mark circled him relentlessly. He perched on the arm of the sofa, a glass of scotch in his hand, firing off questions disguised as casual conversation. "So, Chloe tells us you're in tech," Mark began, leaning forward. "That's a big field. Are you front-end, back-end, slinging code for some startup in a garage somewhere?" The insult was clear. He was painting Julian as a glorified and likely broke computer nerd. "I'm more on the logistics and platform architecture side of things," Julian answered smoothly, offering nothing. "Fascinating," Mark said, his tone indicating it was anything but. "Amanda's cousin's kid does that. Thinks he's the next Zuckerberg. Still lives in his parents' basement," Amanda giggled on cue. Julian just smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to infuriate Mark even more. Mark's eyes flickered down to Julian's wrist. I saw the moment he registered the watch. A tiny, almost imperceptible frown creased his forehead. A Patek Philippe didn't fit the basement coder narrative. It was a dissonant note in the symphony of his judgment. He changed tactics. "Must be tough, the New York rental market. I hear it's brutal. We were just looking at investment properties in the city, but the prices are just insane for what you get." "Are you in the city proper or one of the boroughs?" "We have a place in Manhattan," Julian said, his gaze finding mine across the room. The we was not lost on me, or on anyone else. My mother, sensing the rising tension, called everyone to the dining room. The table was set with the same china, the same silver, the same suffocating sense of tradition. I was seated directly across from Mark, just as I had been last year. But this time Julian was beside me, a solid, grounding presence. The meal began, and so did Mark's next round of interrogation, this time directed at me. "So, Chloe, you still enjoying the library? They giving you a raise for all that hard work, or is it still more of a passion project?" he asked, loading his fork with turkey. "I love my work," I said, my voice even. "And I'm excited to be transitioning to writing full-time." "Oh, writing?" Amanda chirped, her voice dripping with pity. "That's so brave. It's so hard to make a living doing that." "I'll be fine," I said, meeting her gaze. "Julian is very supportive." Mark turned his attention back to my fiancé. "Must be nice having a supportive partner," he said to Julian. "My firm offers a great benefits package for spouses." Does your platform have a 401k plan? Gotta think about the future, you know." The condescension was suffocating. He was talking to Julian like he was a child, a charity case I'd picked up off the street. Julian took a slow sip of water, placed his glass down with deliberate precision, and looked Mark dead in the eye. "Yes," he said, his voice calm and level. "We have a fairly competitive benefits package." The simple, direct answer left Mark nowhere to go. He hated it. He was used to people being intimidated by Him, scrambling to justify themselves. Julian's quiet confidence was like a stone wall to his ego. He fell silent, stewing, the muscle in his jaw working. I knew he was just reloading for his final biggest salvo, and I was ready for it. The whole room was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The clinking of silverware was the only sound. My father cleared his throat, oblivious, and asked if anyone wanted more gravy. The trap was about to spring. The lull in the conversation was deceptive. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet intake of breath before a predator strikes. Mark had been momentarily thrown off by Julian's refusal to be categorized or intimidated, but I knew my brother. He couldn't stand a mystery, especially one that seemed to challenge his own perceived status. He needed to put Julian in a box, label him, and place him on a shelf somewhere beneath himself. He refilled his wine glass, the neck of the bottle clinking against the rim with unnecessary force. He was building himself up for the final act, the one he'd been rehearsing in his head all afternoon. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, theatrical posture I knew all too well. It was his king of the castle pose. He surveyed the table, his gaze sweeping over his wife, his parents, and finally landing on me with a look of profound, pitying magnanimity. It was a near-perfect recreation of last year's toast. "Well, Chloe," he began, his voice booming in the suddenly silent room, "I have to hand it to you." He paused for dramatic effect, making sure he had everyone's undivided attention. "I was a little hard on you last year. I'll admit it." My mother shot him a grateful look, as if this was some grand act of contrition. I knew better. This was the setup. "I really thought you were doomed to a life of spinsterhood and literary obscurity," he continued, the backhanded apology seamlessly morphing into another insult. "But you managed to go out and find Julian?" He said the name with a drawn-out, condescending lilt, as if it were a synonym for some guy. "So, I'd like to propose a toast." He raised his glass. "To Chloe for finally getting on the board, and to Julian for trying." The insult was so perfectly crafted, so layered with smug superiority, that for a second, no one moved. He was dismissing Julian as a worthless striver, a nobody my desperate sister had latched onto. It was the kill shot he'd been waiting to deliver all day. In the ringing silence that followed, a different sound emerged. It was quiet at first, a metallic tapping from the far end of the table. My father, who had been engrossed in his iPad for most of the meal, his usual method of tuning out the family drama, was tapping his finger against the screen. He was staring at it, his face slack with disbelief, his skin suddenly pale under the warm lights of the dining room. "Dad?" my mother asked, her voice laced with concern. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." My father didn't answer. He just slowly, mechanically, lifted his head and looked from the iPad screen to Julian, then back to the screen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mark, annoyed that the focus had shifted from his triumphant moment, scoffed. "Dad, what is it? Did one of your stocks tank?" "Mark," my father finally managed to say, his voice a dry, raspy whisper. "Shut up, just..." "Shut up." This was unprecedented. My father, the conflict avoider, the passive observer, had never in my life spoken to Mark like that. The command was so sharp, so absolute, it cut through the thick tension in the room like a knife. Mark stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. "What did you say to me?" "I said, 'Shut up!'" my father repeated, his voice gaining strength. He turned the iPad around for the table to see. And there it was. The screen glowed with the cover of the latest issue of Forbes magazine. It featured a man in a simple dark t-shirt, staring directly at the camera with a look of quiet, intense confidence. His face was unmistakable. It was Julian. The headline, in bold yellow font, was splashed across his chest. Julian Croft, the silent architect of e-commerce. How the reclusive billionaire behind Artisan built a $50 billion empire on his own terms. Croft. That was his last name. Julian Croft. The name hung in the air, electric and heavy. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It wasn't awkward or tense. It was the profound, deafening silence of a world being turned upside down. My aunt gasped. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Amanda's perfectly made-up face was a mask of utter shock, her jaw literally hanging open. But my eyes were on Mark, all the color drained from his face. The smugness, the arrogance, the casual cruelty. It all evaporated in an instant, replaced by a ghastly gray pallor of pure, unadulterated shock. His mind was scrambling, the gears grinding as he tried to reconcile the man on the magazine cover with the quiet, unassuming man he'd been belittling for the last 2 hours. The Patek Philippe on Julian's wrist suddenly wasn't just a watch. It was a symbol of a stratosphere of wealth Mark could only dream of. The vague tech space comment wasn't the evasion of a loser. It was the deflection of a titan. He had spent the entire day trying to punch up at a man who lived on a different planet. My Julian, didn't even flinch. He hadn't looked at the iPad. He didn't need to. He simply reached over, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently took my hand in his. His thumb stroked the back of my knuckles. He then looked directly at my brother, his expression not triumphant, but simply neutral. It was the calm, unbothered look of a man for whom this entire drama was a minor, insignificant distraction. He gave Mark a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You know, Mark," he said, his voice as calm and even as it had been all day. "You're right about one thing. I am incredibly lucky to have found her." Then he turned his gaze to me, and the love in his eyes was so potent it made my heart ache. "She's the best investment I'll ever make." The room remained frozen, a tableau of shock and shattered perceptions. Mark looked like he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had built his entire identity, his entire sense of self-worth, on a foundation of money and status. He had used that foundation as a weapon against me my entire life. And Julian had just demolished it. Not with a shout, not with an insult, but with the quiet, irrefutable weight of who he was. My revenge was complete. It was silent. It was absolute. And it was sweeter than I ever could have imagined. I squeezed Julian's hand, the sapphire on my finger cool against my skin. The trap hadn't just been sprung. It had vaporized my brother's world right in front of his eyes. The reverberations of the Forbes cover continued to echo in the stunned silence of the dining room. No one seemed capable of speech. My mother kept glancing from Julian to the iPad to me, her expression a bewildered mix of awe and dawning horror at her son's behavior. Amanda looked like she was mentally calculating the net worth of everyone in the room and coming up short. Mark, however, was the epicenter of the implosion. He was visibly shrinking in his chair, the lifeblood of his arrogance completely drained away, leaving behind a pale, hollowed-out shell of a man. He couldn't look at Julian. He couldn't look at me. He stared blankly at the half-eaten turkey, a monument to a celebration that had just died a spectacular death. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had been annihilated and recreated from scratch. For my entire life, I had been a minor character in the story of my family, a satellite orbiting the blazing sun that was my brother. Now the entire solar system had been ripped from its axis and reoriented around me. Julian, ever the master of understatement, seemed to decide that the point had been sufficiently made. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze, a signal that it was time to go. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed deafening in the charged quiet. "Well," he said, addressing my parents with a polite, warm smile that did not extend to my brother. "Thank you so much for dinner. It was delicious. But we have an early flight back to New York in the morning, so I'm afraid we should be going." My mother practically shot out of her seat. "Oh, of course. So soon? You should stay for dessert. I made pumpkin pie." Her voice was an octave higher than usual, laced with a desperate, frantic hospitality. She was scrambling, trying to recover, trying to appease the billionaire her son had just spent 2 hours treating like dirt. "Another time, perhaps," Julian said graciously, his tone leaving no room for argument. I stood up, and together we walked around the table. As we passed Mark, I paused. I looked down at my brother, this man who had caused me so much pain, who had measured my worth and found it wanting. He was staring at his plate, his knuckles white where he gripped his fork. He looked small, pathetic. I felt a surge of something, not pity, but a cold, clean sense of finality. The dynamic between us was forever broken, and he knew it. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. My silence was louder than any insult I could have ever hurled at him. At the front door, as we put on our coats, my father finally seemed to reboot. He walked over, his face etched with a complex emotion I couldn't quite decipher, part embarrassment, part awe. He shook Julian's hand, this time with a firm, respectful grip. "It was an honor to have you in our home, Julian," he said, the words sounding stiff and formal. He then turned to me, and for the first time in a long time, he really looked at me. He saw me, Chloe, not just the daughter who didn't follow the expected path. I'm happy for you, honey, he said, and I knew for once he meant it. We walked down the flagstone path into the cool November night. The air felt crisp and clean, a welcome antidote to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Our driver saw us approaching and had the car door open before we reached the curb. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt like a portal to a different life. A life of ease, of respect. A life where I didn't have to constantly fight for my own worth. As we settled into the back seat, the heated leather warming my cold hands, I glanced back at the house. It was ablaze with light, a perfect picture of suburban domesticity. Through the large dining room window, I could see the frozen silhouettes of my family. They hadn't moved. They were still sitting around the table, trapped in the wreckage of the evening. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, silently. Julian reached over and took my hand again. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked at our intertwined fingers, at the deep blue of the sapphire on my hand. I thought about the decades of small cuts and public humiliations, the endless comparisons, the feeling of always being less than. I thought about Mark's smug face as he delivered his cruel toasts, year after year. He had built a prison of expectations around me, and I had just walked out the front gate, leaving him locked inside. I was more than okay. I was free. I leaned my head against Julian's shoulder, the Chicago skyline beginning to rise in the distance, a glittering promise of the future. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as we sped away, leaving my old life behind in a silent, stunned tableau. We were heading for the airport for New York, for our life. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that Thanksgiving at my parents' house would never be the same again. My brother had wanted a war of status and success. He just hadn't realized I was the one who had the nuclear option. My brother had spent his whole life defining my worth in dollars and cents, so I simply decided to buy his silence. The end.